Boo, jump scare. Yes, it's not a Scottish War of Independence video. I've ran out of those videos to backlog. There will be more. There'll be a Siege of Edinburgh Castle, Thomas Randolph documentary, and also the Irish battles that took place as well. But for now, I feel like it's best to move on to a new topic that I quite like and find interesting. The Anglo-Zulu War. I have posted this month's plan for this video agenda. Next month, it'll finish up with the Zulu War. There'll be 4 videos on this. 4 videos. And in this video, we are going over the Battle of Isandlwana. And I'll just give some backstory on the Zulus, because, you know, that's what it encompasses. The Zulu kingdom, known as KwaZulu, rose from a minor Nguni clan into a fearsome military power under one man. Fans on. Shit, my bad. Shaka Zulu. In the early 19th century, Shaka revolutionised Southern African warfare, creating a regimental system based on age, loyalty and iron discipline. Young men were forced into the Impi, elite warrior regiments, forbidden to marry until they had proven themselves in battle. Kinda like modern Redditors. It didn't make sense. The Zulu army wielded the Ikolwa. There's a lot of African words in this that my ape-brain Scottish Celtic man cannot pronounce. So, suck it. A short stabbing spear designed for close combat, kinda like a duck, but a spear, so nothing alike. Advanced in tight formations using the horns of the buffalo tactic. A picture of it is right here. The head would attack the enemies, the lines at the back would be like a reserve, and the horde would encircle and flank the enemy. This had secured them an empire, a massive empire over their enemies. And there's a bunch of videos you can watch on, and I might even make some videos on Zulu warfare, but like in battles with other tribes. But I kind of want to work on the Zulu war first and some other stuff before that. By the 1870s, Shaka's legacy was carried on by King Cetshwayo Kimpande, who came into power after a bloody civil war against his brother. His rule was marked by military strength, cultural pride, and growing friction with European powers, especially the British, who wanted the Zulu land and labour. The British Empire had set its eyes on Southern Africa. The recent discovery of diamonds in Kimberley had raised the stakes and also gave more incentive to push further into it. British colonial authorities, especially Sir Bartle Frere, some name, the High Commissioner, sought to consolidate power by breaking the independence of native kingdoms, including the Zulu. Although Cetshwayo maintained diplomacy, he refused to dismantle the army that had preserved his nation's sovereignty. In December 1878, Frere had issued an ultimatum to disband the Zulu military and allow British control over international justice and pay compensation for minor cross-border incidents. Basically to just become a protectorate or a puppet state at that point. I don't know the correct definition, I think it is protectorate or vassal. The demands were obviously impossible for any independent king who wants to be independent to accept, and also especially for a warrior-based society, just like the Zulus had, where military was a whole part of their culture. When the deadline expired on January 11th, 1879, the British had got their Cassius Bell and invaded Zululand. Commanding the invasion was Lord Chelmsford, who divided his force into 3 columns. The central column, around 4,700 men, crossed the Buffalo River and advanced into Zululand, reaching Isandlwana on January 20th. The camp was pitched on open ground, accessible near water and wood for cooking, and with clear sightlines, but the camp lacked any fortifications or any sort of like encampment protective structures. It was all just tents and wagons. He also didn't even have scouts or sentries on the perimeter. Wagons remained spread out. Chelmsford dismissed warnings, believing Zulu resistance would be easily broken. So to sum it up, he was very ignorant and underestimated the Zulus, a fucking warrior-based society. This is important foreshadowing. On January 22nd, Lord Chelmsford left the column eastward, pursuing what he assumed was the main Zulu army. It wasn't. Left behind at the camp were around 1,800 men, including nearly 600 British regulars of the 1st Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot, some Natal Irregulars, 2 7-pounder guns, and African auxiliaries under Colonel Henry Pauline. Later that morning, Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived with 500 mounted men to reinforce the camp. But Chelmsford had miscalculated. The main Zulu force, estimated at 20,000 to 22,000 men, was not ahead of him. They were actually hidden in a nearby valley, just miles off the British camp. At daybreak, normal camp activities proceeded, and the bugle call for breakfast was sounded at 7 AM. Then things began to go wrong. The first report came from a nearby hill that a large Zulu force was advancing towards the camp. The bugler sounded the stand to, which is prepare for action, to meet the Zulus. But in the still African morning, nothing happened, and the soldiers began to relax. The Zulu army was led by seasoned commanders Nshingwayo, Kamahol, and Mavu Mengwana, Candela. I said them wrong, I'm really sorry. The Zulus had marched in silence for days, concealed by hills and scrubland. At around 10:30 AM, a patrol stumbled upon the position, triggering a premature attack. The element of surprise was gone, and the Zulu regiment surged forward in the traditional formation. The chest hit the British front, while the horns raced around the flanks to encircle them. Pauline deployed his men in an extended firing line, nearly a mile wide. The Martini Henry rifles opened up in deadly volleys, and the artillery hurled shells into the advancing ranks of Zulus. The Zulus quickly dove down to avoid the shells and artillery fire, and they quickly learned the fire rates like it was fucking Dark Souls fighting a boss. They learned the attacks, and the artillery became useless because whenever they were about to fire, they dove down, it would fly over them harmlessly, they'd get back up and charge forward. Despite massive losses from the Zulu charge, momentum was not lost. Initially, some British officers joked and jeered, confident in their firepower, but the lines were too thin, and the ammunition supply chain broke down, and cartridges failed to reach the front in time. Troops began to run low, and morale began to waver. By early afternoon, the Zulus had breached the left and right flanks. The centre faltered, chaos erupted in the camp. Soldiers tried to form rallying squares, wagons were overturned, oxen stampeded, ammunition was nearly gone, bayonets were drawn. Colonel Durnford led a final stand with mounted men, buying precious moments for others to escape. When their ammo ran out, he ordered them to retreat while he and a small group of men fought to the death. His body was later found surrounded by his men in one of the battle's most famous acts of heroism. Lieutenants Teammouth, Melvin and Neville Coghill attempted to save the Queen's colours of the 1st and 24th. Fighting through Zulu lines on horseback, they crossed the Buffalo River. Coghill's horse was shot, and Melvin was dragged under the current, and both were killed. The colour was later found in the river and recovered weeks later. In 1907, they became among the first posthumous recipients of the Victoria Cross. 2 hours later, over 1,300 British and African auxiliary troops were cut down by spear and assegai. Around 60 men survived the battle. Quick context, it was 60 Europeans that survived the battle, not overall survivors. When Chelmsford returned to the camp that night, he found only bodies and an ocean of blood. Scattered survivors told of the slaughter. Many British corpses were found disemboweled. This was a ritual act by the Zulu warriors to release the spirits from the dead. It wasn't an act of mutilation, but more of spiritual belief, and also kind of nice if you think about it. The 1st Battalion of the 24th Regiment had been virtually annihilated. 52 officers were dead. More than had fallen in the entire Waterloo campaign. An officer who was lucky enough to survive the battle was artillery officer Lieutenant Henry Curling, by escaping on horseback. He wrote, "The camp was in possession of the enemy, who were killing the men as they ran out their tents. We went right through them and out the other side, losing nearly all of our gunners, and 1 or 2 of the sergeants. The road to Rockstraff that we hoped to retreat by was full of the enemies, so no way being opened, we followed a crowd of natives and camp followers who were running down a ravine. The Zulus were all among them, stabbing men as they ran, and finally the guns got stuck and could go no further. In a moment, the Zulus closed in, and the drivers were now alone. And the drivers, who now alone remained, were pulled off their horses and killed." A Zulu warrior who was later interviewed years later said, "Ah, those red soldiers at Isandlwana, how few they were, and how they fought. They fell like stones, each man in his place." Another recalled, "The soldiers gave a shout and charged down upon us. There was an Nduna, an officer, in front of the soldiers with a long flashing sword, which he whirled round his head as he ran. They killed themselves by running down. They threw down their guns when the ammunition was done, and then commenced with their pistols, which they fired as long as their ammunition lasted. And then they formed a line, shoulder to shoulder, and back to back, and fought with their knives. Some covered their faces with their hands, not wishing to see death. Some entered into their tents, indignant, although badly wounded. They died where they stood, at their post. News of the defeat reached London in early February, causing shock, anger and disbelief. The British government hadn't been fully briefed by Ferry about the attack on Zululand, and initially were not overwhelmingly in the mood for war. However, this news galvanised the government to save face. Paradoxically, the Zulu victory at Isandlwana that was planned by Cetshwayo that was to be used to negotiate a peace deal only caused more death. Britain poured reinforcements into southern Africa, determined to avenge the loss. The Zulus were victorious, had stirred a colonial giant. This battle of Isandlwana stands as a testament to courage, discipline and military genius by both the British and Zulus. This battle also shattered the myth of British invincibility and reminded the world that even the greatest empires are not immune to defeat. This battle was also one of the worst defeats a technologically advanced army faced to an inferior one. And that's the video. That's pretty much it. Maybe a bit short, but there's more context in later episodes. Next video is the Battle of Rorkes Drift, which is one of my personal favourite battles in British history. But until then, I'll see you later, and goodbye. Also, I didn't really say anything, but yeah, it's a new background, and there's my armour that I bought. My helmet's up there, and there's my cool lion rampant. Welcome to another video, the Battle of Rorkes Drift. In the last video, we went over the disaster of the Battle of Isandlwana, and later that same day, after the Battle of Isandlwana, I don't know why I've repeated myself, a second Zulu force was led by Cetshwayo's brother, Debula Manzani Kimpande, who commanded the Ulundi Corps at the previous mentioned Battle of Isandlwana, and he planned to capture and overrun the British depot and hospital of Rorkes Drift, known to the Zulus as Kwajimu. Rorkes Drift, sited near the banks of the Buffalo River, approximately 100 miles north of present-day Durban, was originally a trading post established by James Rorke, and it had become a Swedish missionary station intended as a base of operations for Christian missionaries. By the time of the war, its two single-storey buildings had been converted into a hospital and a storehouse. The mission station was occupied by Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead and his company of 150 men, as well as 100 Natal native contingent troops, but Lieutenant John Chard had been dispatched from the main army before the Battle of Isandlwana to begin orders to make defensive preparations at Rorkes Drift, and as the senior officer, he took command. Survivors from Isandlwana soon reached Rorkes Drift with news of the approaching Zulu army of around 3,000 to 4,000 men. Both lieutenants, John Chard and Gonville Bromhead, met with Assistant Commissary James Dalton of the Commissariat and Transport Department to decide whether they should retreat or defend the station. Dalton argued that their small force travelling in open country burdened with hospital patients would be easily caught by the fast-moving Zulus, so it was agreed that they would stay and fight. By this point, the defenders numbered nearly 500 due to the native contingents of infantry and cavalry, but this was soon to change. The cavalry, about 100 native troops who survived Isandlwana, positioned themselves on the far side of a large hill from where the Zulus were expected to approach. Meanwhile, in camp, fortifications were being erected from biscuit boxes as well as mealie bags weighing around 90 kilograms. As time passed, the Swedish missionaries assigned to the station, Otto Witt, fled with his companions. The native cavalry troops then briefly engaged with the Zulus the second time that day, but eventually turned and retreated from the area and left the battle behind. When the Zulu army was finally spotted by the remaining native contingent, they also fled. One fleeing NCO, Corporal Anderson, was shot in the back by a 24th defender. All that remained was 150 men, with almost 40 of them being already wounded, so the odds already aren't looking great. Also, before we get into the proper battle, it's important to remember that Chichwayo Kimampande, the king of the Zulus, did not want the Battle of Rorkes to go ahead. This was because he wanted to preserve Zulu sovereignty and avoid full-scale war with the British, and he strictly instructed his commanders to avoid crossing into British territory, aka where Rorkes was stationed, as that could provoke escalation and make the British more aggressive in response. But some regiments, particularly younger warriors, were eager for honour and disobeyed his orders, and they chased a smaller British force that retreated the Battle of Isandlwana to Rorkes. The Zulu army at Rorkes arrived at 4:30 PM and the first assault began. As around 600 Zulus attacked the south wall, while most of them approached from the north, the majority of Zulus were armed with spears and hide shields, but some of them were armed with rifles and muskets, with some of them being taken from the dead Brits at isandlwana. The Brits were armed with Martini Henry breech loader rifles, which fired at a rate of 12 rounds per minute for around 20,000 rounds of ammunition in the depot. The fire rate is important because some people use the argument guns beat spears, which, they do, but in this scenario, the British were outnumbered around 20 to 27 to 1. So, no matter how much guns you have, or bullets you have, you're going to be boned in this fight, especially considering a lot of them can't shoot because they were wounded already. And also the fact that a lot of them too were engineers who were tasked with building a bridge. When the Zulus were within 500 metres of the British soldiers, they opened fire to maximise their chance of hitting, the Zulus. Due to them being vastly outnumbered, the British soldiers were not repelling the Zulu wave by just shooting and quickly devolved into close quarter combat with fixed bayonets. Luckily for the mission's high walls, it prevented the Zulus from overwhelming the British defenders, but the British couldn't push them back either. So it was just fucking chaos. It was just chaos. It was just fighting. British soldiers who were too badly wounded to shoot were tasked with reloading guns and distributing ammunition to those who could still fire. And you can see in some paintings wounded men handing ammunition, and also in the movie Zulu you have the same thing. Also, many of the Zulus who had firearms lacked training and were terrible shots. They were like Copper 1 and ranked in Siege. Around 6 PM, Lieutenant Chard gave the orders to abandon the defence of the north wall and pull back into the yard. This left the rooms in the hospital undefended. This left 2 of the rooms in the hospital undefended. Although loopholes had been made in the hospital walls, these were proving useless, with so many of the Zulus in close quarter combat, and also the Zulus either snatching the guns in the holes in the wall, or using it themselves with their own weapons. As the battle raged on, the Zulus targeted the hospital. They set fire to the building and burst in and began killing the patients with their spears. But the defenders fixed their bayonets and managed to push them back out of the hospital. The surviving patients were then rescued after Private John Williams hacked through the wall and rescued the remaining patients out of harm's way as the Zulus attacked the door for almost an hour while Private Alfred Hook held it shut. These 2 privates saved 9 lives, with only 2 of the patients actually dying. As night in the hospital fell, the defenders retreated to the far end of the mission. Their perimeter was now smaller, and the barricade of biscuit boxes became the last line of defence. The Zulus continued their constant harassment throughout the night, but the defenders held. From midnight to pre-dawn, the attacks lessened over time. As the sun rose, the British prepared for another attack, but it never came. The Zulus had left the battle while leaving behind their dead and wounded men. After 12 hours of fighting, the battle was finally over, with around 400 Zulus laying dead, with only 17 British casualties, but almost every man in the garrison suffered some sort of wound. Around 7 AM, the Zulus were spotted again, but they were retreating, and after the battle, the British only had 900 rounds of ammunition left. They shot a lot of fucking bullets. The British government seized the opportunity after the success of the defence of Rorkes, issuing awards to the survivors in hopes of diverting public attention away from isandlwana. Some of these awards included Lieutenant John Rouse Merit Chard, Lieutenant Gonville Bromhead, Corporal William Wilson Allen, Private Frederick Hitch, Private Alfred Henry Hook, Private Robert Jones, Private William Jones, Private John Williams, Sergeant Mayor James Henry Reynolds, Acting Assistant Commissionary James Langley Dalton, Corporal Christian Ferdinand Scheiss. Also, had posthumous Victoria Crosses been possible in 1879, it would have been a lot higher number. Private Joseph Williams, who was killed in the fighting, was noted in reports as having been recommended for the award, but the attempt to divert attention by handing a lot of awards didn't work, and the Prime Minister of the time, Benjamin Disraeli administration, lost the 1880 election, brought down in part by the events of the Zulu War the previous year. Even so, heroism at Rorkes rather than the defeat at isandlwana that passed into British folklore, and that's kind of it. The Battle of Rorkes is one of the most impressive battles fought in history, I would argue at least, where a lot of men held out against overwhelming odds and didn't give up or try to surrender. Even so, I don't know if they could surrender, I don't know if the Zulus took prisoners, I'll put a little thing if they did or not. Next video is the Battle of Kambula, plus some more context of the Zulu-Anglo War. Anyway, sorry for the short video, but there's not much I can cover. Isandlwana and Rorkes kind of go hand in hand as like one major video, and as you can tell, it was kind of structured that way because I plan on making one big mega video at the end of the series. But yeah, I'll see you next week, chuds, for Kambula. Welcome to another Anglo-Zulu war. Just before the video starts, I just want to say we are so close to hitting 100 subs on the History channel. Yes, I have two. There's a gaming one right here, link to it in the description. I would be ecstatic if we could hit, the 100 subs before the next video, which is going to be the Battle of Ulundi. And with that, welcome to the video. If you haven't already, watch the previous two, isandlwana and Rorkes, to get more context on this war and this battle right here. Isandlwana is quite important for this, but without any further ado, welcome to the Battle of Kambula. On January 22nd, the disaster of Isandlwana overtook the central column. When news of the defeat arrived, both southern and northern column commanders paused to assess the situation. Colonel Charles Person encamped at Ishoni and was eventually besieged by the Zulus. Further north, Colonel Evelyn Wood was preparing to move against a Zulu force based on a flat-top mountain called Holbein, but he called that off when news of Isandlwana had reached him, and he retreated to set up a fortified camp on a steep-sided plateau named Kambula. A lager of wagons tightly locked together by chains was formed and a stone cattle corral was built, both of which was ringed by trenches and earth parapets. A stone redoubt was erected on the summit. A palisade blocked the gap between the corral and the redoubt, and 4 7-pounder field guns defended the northern approaches. Under Wood's command, there was 1,238 infantrymen, 638 mounted men, and 121 Royal Engineers and Royal Artillery, but 88 were ill and unable to fight. Eventually, Colonel Wood, with none of the Zulu reinforcements he had anticipated having turned up, he decided to tackle the force at Holbein, and on 28th of March, he attacked, but with impeccably poor timing, as a sizable Zulu impi force arrived. Wood's men were driven off back to Kambula. There, Colonel Wood and his 2,000 men again waited. The Zulus before Kambula were under orders not to attack, but to try and attempt to provoke Colonel Wood to come out into an open ground battle to fight, where their superior numbers and greater understanding of the ground would give them an advantage. However, Lieutenant Colonel Redvers Buller led a daytime assault to provoke a superior Zulu force into attacking the British camp instead, and after returning to camp he realised that 3 of his men were missing. So, what did he do? He, without hesitation, returned to the scene and brought them back to camp, with Zulus less than 100 to 200 yards away from them. The provocation worked, and the Zulus set their eyes on the British camp, and by 12:45 PM the British defenders were ready and awaited the Zulus. Colonel Wood had drilled his men to be in positions in less than 2 minutes, so he insisted that they ate a meal before going into action. The tents were struck and reserve ammunition distributed as the Zulu impi drew closer, in 5 columns composed of 9 regiments, the majority of whom had fought at Isandlwana. Many of them were armed with Martini Henry rifles taken from the dead Brits from that battle, but had picked up some debuffs along the way as they had not eaten since leaving Ulundi, the Zulu capital, and were tired from jog trotting for 3 days. Collingwood knew that those who had fought Isandlwana arrived in the vicinity the day before the battle and slept the night concealed in a nearby valley, so they had enough time to recover after the long trek from Ulundi. But today, the enemy would be denied the advantage of a rest period, so another unnecessary debuff. Colonel Wood agreed with Lieutenant Colonel Buller's suggestion that he should take 30 men of his own mounted troops to provoke the Zulus again. When a gap was opened for them, they rode straight at the right horn, dismounted at a few hundred yards and fired 1 volley. The effect was instantaneous. Around 20,000 Zulus sprang up and swarmed forward with a mighty roar as the Frontier Light Horse Cavalry unit fled back with Asenge brandishing warriors in hot pursuit. Unfortunately for 3 horsemen, a wide patch of swampy ground slowed down their steeds and they were cut down and speared to death. The infantry went into action when Buller's men returned and they fired a concentrated volley. The 7-pounder guns caused havoc with exploding shrapnel shells, checking the Zulu advance at 300 yards. Direct fire from riflemen in the lager and redoubt soon forced the Zulus to fall back to the cover of a rocky outcrop in the northeast. With their strategy disrupted, the Zulus were unable to complete the encirclement of the Kambula camp, allowing the garrison in the northern and western areas to repel the Zulu advance from the opposite quarter. At 12:15 PM, the Zulu left and centre again attempted to develop their attack, using dead ground below the ridge to the south and unfazed by the heavy fire. They came at the defenders in a series of waves, inspired by the belief of spiritual protection offered by rituals and medicines. They threw themselves recklessly at the barricades but were then mowed down by shrapnel and volley fires from the infantry defending the lager's south face. At one stage, some Zulus breached the outer defences and charged down the plateau to attack the entrenched positions. A few reached the lager wagons and crawled between the wheels only to be bayoneted or shot to death. Wood, who had stationed himself between the lager and redoubt, was not against taking part in the fight himself and was restrained by his officers when he attempted to go and aid a wounded trooper who had been shot outside the redoubt. Minutes later, seeing that Private William Fuller, a member of his personal escort, was unsuccessful in trying to kill a Zulu commander, he grabbed the rifle from Fuller and, aiming at the Induna's feet, dropped him with a single bullet to the stomach. Wood is then reported to have fired again at other Zulus and then returned the rifle to Fuller with instructions to adjust the sights. So, just aura farming. About 40 Zulus with rifles climbed to the rim of the ravine and began firing down at the defenders in the cattle corral, forcing their withdrawal into the redoubt. Helped by a thick smoke screen from 100 of black powder cartridges, Zulus took control of the corral until Wood ordered 2 companies of the 90th Light Infantry to retake it with a bayonet charge. Although hampered by hundreds of terrified oxen, the troopers pushed a wagon out of the way to provide a clear run, formed a line of bayonets, and forced the Zulus back into the ravine. The attack on the redoubt was likewise repulsed at 3 PM, and as the Zulus withdrew, gunners of the Royal Artillery poured down rounds directly into them. The retreat gave riflemen an opportunity to spread out along the crest to unleash their own deadly volleys at the Zulus below. However, a few stubborn Zulu groups attempted more charges at the British line, but they were easily cut down. About 4:30 PM, when the Zulus were getting away, Colonel Wood sent Buller and 3 companies of mounted colonials in pursuit, and the retreat became a rout. Riders enacted a savage revenge for Isandlwana and every single dead friend they had lost on the retreating Zulus. The Frontier Light Horse Cavalry unit were followed by infantry and African auxiliaries on foot, who had combed the field and killed many Zulus who were lying wounded or hidden. The chase continued for several miles, and the bloodbath only ended at sunset when it began to rain. In the end, the estimated Zulu death count was 2,000, while the British and their allies lost a mere 83. And with word that another invasion was happening, the Zulu chances were not looking good, and that's the end of the battle. Kambula was a decisive and crucial battle of the war. It nullified the Zulu victory at Isandlwana, and even though in previous battles we've seen that The Zulus' technological inferiority meant nothing at Isandlwana as they decimated unorganised troops, and also at the previous hub lane where they were just outnumbered and also a bit got lucky as well. People always like to say, oh, guns versus spears, but in each video you can see why that's not the case. This video, the British won while being wildly outnumbered due to their fortified position. Spears lose to guns, but when you have 20,000 Zulus, it doesn't really fucking matter. Welcome to another video in the last chapter of the Anglo-Zulu War, the Battle of Ulundi. Also, quick disclaimer, my dog is going fucking apeshit, so if you're a lot of barking, that's the dog's fault, not mine. On the 2nd of April 1879, a British column under the command of Lord Chelmsford inflicted a heavy defeat on the Zulus at Ginginduvulu, that word, where around 1,000 Zulus lay dead. This occurred while he was trying to make his way to relieve Colonel Charles Pearson's column, which was under siege at the fortified camp of Ishoni. After relieving Ishoni and pushing back the Zulus, Chelmsford determined that it wasn't important to hold on to this position, so he evacuated and destroyed the camp. By the end of the month, most of the Chelmsford men were back in Natal, where he began preparing for a second and final invasion into Zululand. With this organised retreat, it gave the appearance that the Zulus had pushed back the Brits out of Zululand, even if only superficial, but the Battle of Kambula and Ginginduvulu had caused heavy casualties on the Zulus with very little losses on the British side. And at the same time, Sir Garrett Wolseley and the Ashanti Ring were on their way to replace Lord Chelmsford's command, but Chelmsford didn't want to give up his position. In the base move of nuh-uh, he launched another invasion into Zululand at the end of May 1879 to try and redeem himself and salvage the situation, while also ignoring all of King Cetshwayo's envoys attempting to negotiate peace. The reinforced invasion force of around 25,000 British soldiers, where only a portion of that force would take part in the actual final Battle of Ulundi, made steady progress despite logistical concerns and constant skirmishing with Zulu forces. Colonel Wood began to march south from Kambula to meet up with the main British invasion force, which was crossing the river at Tugela. On the 21st of May 1879, Major General Marshall, leading a cavalry brigade, advanced to Isandlwana to undertake the grim task of burying the dead British soldiers. By early June, the advance of the main force finally begun. As Chelmsford sat in his tent awaiting orders, a staff officer burst in and told him that the French prince had died at the hands of the Zulus. Now, this might be absolutely confusing for anyone who doesn't know the context, and don't worry, I'll give it. In 1871, Emperor Napoleon III of France was deposed and later died in exile in England. His widow, Empress Eugenie, became a close friend of Queen Victoria. Napoleon's only son, Louis Napoleon, attended the Royal Military College at Woolwich. Through the Queen's intercession, the Prince Imperial was permitted to accompany the army to Natal and join Chelmsford's column. While on patrol, the Prince Imperial was caught off guard and killed by the Zulus. His death caused an outcry in France. Lieutenant Carey of the 98th Regiment was court-martialed, but he was later acquitted. Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte's great-nephew died in the Anglo-Zulu War, fighting for the British. Colonel Wood's column, renamed by Chelmsford as the Flying Column, and the 2nd Division met and marched towards Ulundi in parallel. On the 5th of June 1879, Buller's irregular horsemen encountered a strong Zulu force. After exchanges of fire, it became clear that the Zulus would not give ground, and Buller withdrew. The 17th Lancers came up and, keen to establish themselves, rode down the valley looking for the Zulus. They came under heavy fire, and their adjutant was shot and killed. The mounted forces returned to camp, where the death of the officer adversely affected the morale of the column. On the 6th of June 1879, a picket caused a false alarm, and the British troops rushed to take position in the entrenched area of the camp. Fire was given, and some 1,200 rounds were discharged without a target before the troops could be brought under control. The incident was due to the nervousness and fear of these inexperienced troops and their fear of the Zulus. General Sir Garrett Wolseley arrived in Cape Town on the 28th of June 1879 and cabled Chelmsford, who replied that his two columns were within 17 miles of the Royal Corral of Ulundi, Mogd. On the 30th of June, The British Line column and the 2nd Division advanced into the valley of the White Malothe River towards Ulundi. Camp was established by the river, and on the 3rd of July, Colonel Buller took his mounted men across the river to recon the Zulu position. The Zulus were waiting in ambush, and Buller's forces only narrowly escaped annihilation. During that night, the British troops were forced to listen to Zulu war songs. For some, this was an interesting cultural experience. For most, it was terrifying. Next day, Chelmsford took the majority of his force, who numbered around 5,000 strong, across the river, advancing towards the Zulu Corral. The British troops moved in a cumbersome hollow square, with mounted troops covering each side in the rear. Just before 9 AM, the Zulus attacked the hollow square on all 4 sides. As the attack began, the British mounted troops moved inside the square. The fire from the packed British regiment, the artillery and the Gatling guns were overwhelming. It was the largest concentration of British military might in South Africa to that day. Zulu survivors and prisoners stated that after the battle they were overwhelmed by the noise of the firing, let alone the impact of the bullets, and stunned by the size of the British force. After about 45 minutes of intense fighting, the Zulus began to falter. At this point, the 17th Lancers passed out of the back of the square and charged. The impact of this charge broke up what was left of the Zulu formation, and the Zulu army dissolved into flight, pursued by the Lancers and the mounted irregular units of Chelmsford's column. The massacre of fleeing Zulus seen at Kambula and Jinjindivili was repeated and multiplied several times. It was the end of the Zulu army and the war. Although fighting continued on in small scale for some weeks, as soon as the battle was over, Chelmsford ordered his troops to destroy the Royal Corral of Ulundi. And the casualties of the battle on the British side were 3 officers and 79 men, while the Zulus were said to be around 1,500. After the battle, King Cetshwayo was hunted down and captured in the Ngome forest in August that year. The Zulu monarchy and local chieftains were suppressed, and Zululand was divided into autonomous regions. Cetshwayo's possessions were seized, and he was exiled to Robben Island in Cape Town and later to London. In this absence, civil war ensued. In 1883, the British attempted to restore order by returning Cetshwayo to the throne. However, his powers were now greatly reduced, and he died the following year. In 1887, Zululand was declared British territory and finally annexed to Natal 10 years later. And that sums up a very simplified version of the Anglo-Zulu War. This was my first attempt at covering a full war, if you don't count my Battle of Zanzibar video, because that was, the Anglo-Zanzibar War was really short, and probably doesn't count in the same regard as a full war video. This is going to be like 40 minutes long. I've posted separate parts, but I'm going to do the overall part for, more views and for more neatness and overall comprehension. I'm probably going to do more videos of Zulus before the war, because that's even more interesting. But for now, I'm going to focus on some smaller things like Darien Scheme and the Act of Union in the following weeks, and some more Scottish stuff. But please, give me your reviews on how I did and anything that I should change. My name is Scottish Logs, and thank you for watching.
Listen, that's my job. That's my job. That's my job.